Indigenous programs are facing more than $2 billion in budget cuts in the latest fiscal budget. The cuts are by 2% of both Indigenous Services Canada and Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada, for a total of more than $2 billion. For more on this, we're joined by Tracee Smith. She is the founder and CEO of Keewaywin. And Tracee, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Initial look at this budget, any surprises, or was it where you expected it to be, and is it disappointing?
Yeah, I think most Indigenous people are used to these kind of budget cycles in terms of, being disappointed every year with the budget. I think what's more notable and more disappointing is the cuts to Indigenous Services Canada and Indigenous Crown Relations, that 2% cut, or 2.3 billion over 5 years. So I think that's really going to be felt on the ground in these communities across the country in terms of, being able to reach out to these departments for assistance when needed. So that's a really big blow, I think, to communities on the ground, and quite disappointing.
And how would they feel those, how would they feel those cuts? In what way?
Well, when, the government says that these cuts are coming more from an efficiency perspective, meaning they're going to be cutting back on bureaucrats sitting in those offices. So, you don't need to worry. People on the ground should be okay. But when, our communities contact these offices and look for support and knowledge and assistance in terms of leveraging these programs, there's no one there to answer the call. In my travels to many communities, the frustration continues to grow with dealing with these departments in terms of accessing the financing they're entitled to, and also the programs they need to continue to build infrastructure, housing, health, education, right? Like, these are significant cuts that definitely will be felt for the next 5 years.
Okay, now the government says it's bringing in some new financing tools for First Nation infrastructure. Is it going far enough? What do you think of it?
Yeah, you know what? There's actually no new money for housing. I know the government has said that, the Canadian Infrastructure Bank has additional financing for Indigenous infrastructure, but at the core of it, their vision is not really focused on Indigenous housing and infrastructure. They're focused more on energy projects and nuclear deals and things like that. They're not really focused on what brings health to our communities. So, it's a really big blow in terms of no new money for infrastructure. We have a government here that's announcing the Build Canada Homes strategy, but yet there's no new money for Indigenous housing. It doesn't really make any sense to us about how you can announce, a new department and new housing initiatives for Canada, but not announce new housing dollars for Indigenous people.
And what about your thoughts on they're expanding the Indigenous tax jurisdiction through new value-added, I'm just reading this, new value-added sales tax arrangements for fuel and alcohol and other, the likes cannabis, tobacco. Will that help, or are certain groups that are going to take advantage of that? They've already been doing it, and it won't expand beyond that?
Yeah, like those are very few and far between communities that are leveraging those kinds of opportunities. I'd say 95% of First Nations aren't really looking at those kinds of measures. Absolutely, those bands have been taking advantage of, if they are in the tobacco business, more and more communities have cannabis shops running around in their communities. And, that's a whole nother governance issue around, taxation, et cetera. So absolutely, I think once people wrap their heads around how to govern around the tax issue and implementing those kinds of measures in our communities, that should work long term. But it's not, I wouldn't say it's front of mind for most of our communities. It's not really a priority for the majority of our First Nations.
Now you do have some optimism on the crowd in private capital.
So the private capital piece, is always going to be an opportunity because there's way more private capital than there is government money, right? So I think, more and more people, including ourselves, are looking at how can we leverage private capital to fill in these huge gaps in terms of government funding. Indigenous priorities, don't usually take a high note in government. It doesn't get leaders their votes that they want to be reelected. So we need to find other solutions other than government funding to fill these kinds of gaps.
And are you finding them?
Oh, absolutely. There's definitely more and more investors that want to put their money to not only getting a return with their capital, but also making a social impact. I was recently at a conference where, I said to the people in the crowd, like, you're used to seeing these dilapidated houses on the front page of the Toronto Star or the Globe and Mail, and you feel kind of helpless as a Canadian because you're like, there's nothing I can do here. Now there's more opportunities for investors to put their private capital into different various funds or investments so that they can affect, the social issues within this country that they see the government's not tackling and not making a priority. So more and more private money are finding new ways to come in and help Indigenous people the best way that they can with what we can do right now.
Okay, Tracee, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Tracee Smith is founder and CEO of Keewaywin.